To Bring It Home, your show about American reindustrialization, the manufacturing renaissance, or is it? And all things reshoring. I'm your host, JP Hampstead. I'm here today with Zach Strickland, Director of Free Market Intelligence at SONAR. He is an expert on the physical goods economy, deeply tapped into the movement of manufacturing and retail goods through all modes of transportation, and of course their storage in warehouses and distribution and fulfillment. Great to have you, Zach.
Yeah, thanks for having me out this week, JP.
Of course. It's always good to talk. He also has a great show, Freightonomics, where you discuss similar themes to what we'll be talking about on this episode, which is really just measuring the manufacturing economy, kind of getting a temperature check, checking for signs of life, that sort of thing.
Freightonomics, of course, talks about the transportation mainly of those goods and supply chain management, inventory management. So as manufacturing, obviously a huge relationship there. A lot of people were really excited, to start the year about some of this trade policy stuff that's been kind of tamped down a little bit over the last several months. But the idea of moving goods more frequently in the freight and the United States was it was supposed to be a huge boon for transportation markets, but it hasn't necessarily manifested that way.
Right. The idea being that instead of only being responsible for the transportation of like a finished good from, say, the Port of Los Angeles, transloading it, outside of Ontario, California, getting it into a distribution center in Dallas, then shipping it out to sort of the vast hinterland of the United States. If the entire manufacturing process was located in the U.S., you would have all of the suppliers, all of the little components and the raw materials all getting moved around. And supposedly it was going to be a giant like bonanza for truckers. That didn't quite materialize, or it hasn't yet. Honestly, there hasn't been time.
Right.
But I also don't want to sort of be in the position of just be sort of like a blind plan truster. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
It hasn't happened yet, but that also doesn't mean it's going to happen.
Right. In theory, and we can see that in the data, like industrial production in the United States, is topped out, like it's flat for the last decade. And the idea was that we had kind of been starting to rely too much.
I should say industrial production manufacturing.
Right.
It's been completely flat for the past 20 years. We have not recovered pre-pandemic levels.
And there's the debate. You and I were talking about it before the show. Are we looking at industrial production and manufacturing the right way? Is this an antiquated view of how we, think about production? Because theoretically, we haven't really lost the ability to make things. We just aren't because of economics and that dynamic shifting, because companies and businesses have gone elsewhere over the last 30, 40 years on purpose. That has been part of our policy for the last 30, 40 years, because we didn't necessarily view those. We thought that was a good way for us to kind of help, globalization, in terms of we have an influence now in places like China, Japan, Europe. If you have more integration in some of these environments, you have more sway. Therefore, we start to kind of come together. Now, since COVID, things have fractured a little bit. And then, of course, there's the whole ongoing China debate about how much, are they being predatory? We had the Silk Road initiatives and things like that a lot of these countries, including our own, were becoming increasingly skeptical of. Right. And if they were not necessarily helping the globalization, but actually hurting it in the long run.
Yeah, and some of those have been some of those Silk Road initiatives have been backed out of. Some of them have just outright failed. Some, when you have government, as impressive as China's manufacturing prowess is, I don't think that most people would say that the Communist Party of China is the most prudent capital allocator in the world. You know what I'm saying? They just throw money at things and build things that aren't necessarily needed. The capacity outpaces demand and for many things. And that's been tracked for a while. And so some of these projects were sort of misguided. Some of them were intentional debt traps for those countries. Some of them were, just very, there are many stories and many different reasons why those were built. But one big part of the story has to do with monetary policy and just the strength of the U.S. dollar. Can you explain a little bit about how that works to sort of limit, our manufacturing?
Yeah. So what has happened over the last several decades is the dollar has become the gold standard for most of the world. A lot of the global economies, the biggest investors in the United States have been a lot of these other countries. What that does is it increases the value of the dollar relative to their currencies. China is probably the most infamous for doing this, devaluing their currency in relation to ours so that we purchase more of their stuff. It's more affordable.
And the system has been set up. I mean, there are several sort of reasons why it exists. At a basic level, you can think, we know that like oil and many other global commodity markets are denominated in dollars, which means that they're priced in dollars. And ultimately, if your country wants to buy a bunch of oil, it has to buy them with dollars. That means that foreign countries have to own dollars, which means they have to sell their own currency and buy dollars, right? So so implicitly like reducing the demand for their own currency, increasing the demand for our currency. This is the system that allows the U.S. government to sort of function in a perpetual like fiscal deficit, right? Because we're essentially, we're printing IOUs, in the form of bonds that we know that other people want, right? We know there's a global appetite for the United States federal government debt. At least there has been historically, and, when the market gets saturated, yields go up and things like that. But the sort of need to buy things in dollars and other countries' sort of requirement or the necessity of them owning a lot of dollars has propped up the dollar relative to other currencies.
But what that does, if we make something now, the cost of a widget in America, if we send it over to another country, that the cost of that widget is now, it's been built in our economy where it's more expensive to make it and manufacture it. So now other countries can't afford the stuff that we make. And
as the value of the dollar changes relative to their currencies, it becomes even more expensive.
Exactly. And that's been probably one of the largest contributors to kind of the flatlining of manufacturing. We haven't lost manufacturing over the last 10 years, as we saw in the data. It's just become less of a percentage of our total output in GDP.
Right.
And some of the jobs have been lost in the manufacturing sector just because we're getting better at making stuff. We talked about it before the show. The amount of labor that it requires to make the same amount of things has gone down because of automation, infrastructure improvements, and things like that. So it's, even though we're fine in terms of like keeping the manufacturing we have, we just haven't been growing that output because we kind of don't. There's some things too, regulations have an influence as well. Environmentally, we're a little bit more locked up, and for good reason in a lot of situations, but some of these other countries don't have the environmental conscientiousness. There's products that moves on trucks that is extremely toxic to the environment that we make on other places of the country. Now, this is an ongoing debate on whether or not that's the right move or not, too, because what's bad for the globe is also bad for our community. Just because we don't make it here doesn't mean that it
doesn't affect us.
Yeah, exactly.
Or affect the ocean or whatever.
But that's part of it, too, is that we have some regulations. We're a first world country. And we're kind of, there's some competitive advantages to manufacturing in other places based on our currency value, as well as the labor cost and also the environmental regulations.
And the sort of the upshot, the benefits that people have seen from that, outsourcing manufacturing, of course, are undeniable that there have been some, right? And I mean, like a simple example is just that the fact that like televisions have massively increased in quality and their price relative to their quality has like dropped like massively as well.
Right.
And that's a function both of like the advance in technology, but also in the sort of the monetary like system that we were talking about before, where it becomes cheaper for us to buy foreign goods as the value of the dollar increases against foreign currencies. And so it hasn't been without benefits that have to every sort of American consumer. there's lots of stuff you can get really cheap compared to other countries. And actually, people still, like Europeans especially, still come to the US and spend what we would think, extravagantly. And to them, it's like, oh, will be my only opportunity in my life to like buy this like luxury good or whatever, because it's far too expensive in France or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, the American consumer likes options, and that's kind of where we're at economically. Is a lot of the reason that we outsource a lot of this stuff, because in Asia, a lot of these factories, they're not necessarily automated. There's a lot of like manual labor in these factories, but they're extremely flexible in the way that they can retool their factories to build or make a lot of different stuff. You can make a plastic widget one day and then turn around a few weeks later and retool it and make a metal widget the next day or in a few weeks. And that's something that we're not super good at here in the United States, because we don't have the labor force, and our labor force is so expensive. We like to build things, automate them, and have this like huge infrastructure around it. Whereas over there, like our clothing tastes change overnight. So they can change the way that they build clothes real quick. Like it's not a big effort for them.
And to get back to the sort of preferences of the American consumer, it seems like people really want like decent quality things quickly and cheaply.
Yep.
Most people, and I'm talking about just the average consumer, the type of just like sort of middle class family that spends a ton of money in retail, right? If we think about like sort of like really high end goods made in first world countries, right? Like a German watch, or like a some sort of like British you know tweed coat, or leather good or something like that, right? It's going to be extremely high quality, but expensive and slow to get.
Right.
And that's not what Americans typically care about or want. We live fast-paced lifestyles. We're very mobile. Moving from place to place. We stay very busy. Have lots of sort of activities and hobbies, and we want new stuff all the time.
Yeah, we're more like right now the gross. We're more about quantity than quality, and the thing that we like today is out of style tomorrow. And some of these high-end luxury items, they're very cheap to make. It's just they have a brand and marketing around it that creates this kind of need. There's status surrounding a lot of this stuff in America, and so if for us, we have short attention spans. And that's what moves a lot of our economy. That's why we have so much freight moving on the trucks a lot of times, is because this season, like we're getting ready for the holiday season.
Because of like seasonal turnovers of inventory.
But the toy this year that's going to be big will be completely different from the toy that was big last year.
And no one's going to hold it for a year for the next holiday season.
And we have seasons that hey, lawnmowers are going to come into style here, for freight movement here in the next, bit. But this year's lawnmower is going to be more,
a whole new generation of 28-year-olds will buy their first green egg, in May or whatever.
And a lot of the barriers to entry here in America are the fact that we're just not that flexible with our manufacturing processes, because our labor is fairly expensive. Like it's not something that you can just retool overnight and make. You need a long-term plan and sustainability for that manufacturer to commit to building here, because it is so expensive.
Right. And the automation, while it can make things faster and cheaper, it is less flexible by definition.
Well, it's the old,
so if you
want a Model T, we'll give it to you in black. Like any color you want, we'll give it to you in black. And that's kind of the American manufacturing story.
Yeah, and but the more hands-on a manufacturing process is, in theory, the more like flexible it is, and the more it can be adapted, because you give the human workers a new set of instructions. You don't have to, order new machines that, by the way, aren't built in the U.S. and reprogram them and retool your factory. So highly automated manufacturing processes are more rigid, less flexible, less adaptable.
It sets up well for automotive, which is the thing that we kind of invented, is the assembly lines. But we've kind of automated a lot of the vehicle manufacturing. But some of the smaller components and pieces that go into these vehicles, we don't make those. We send the raw goods to other countries to manufacture and assemble, and don't bring those in. Like there's specialization in these other countries that, you can't just put a tariff on something and think all of a sudden we have expertise enough to make some of these very specialized components that go into these things, especially when you're talking about advanced chips, semiconductor. They have decades. Think about it if you've been doing something for 20 years and all of a sudden you expect this new person to come in and do your job overnight. That's sort of what we're kind of struggling with right now on some of these goods.
Right. And then, you bring in all, you sort of change the cost to produce all these different components, which blows up like the gross margins of the finished product. Right. And, all sorts of, there's so many different
curve.
So many different knock-on effects. One of the things I wanted to mention, another metric that's kind of a corollary or sort of the other side of the coin, to flat industrial production and manufacturing over the past decade, is that, of course, the overall economy has still continued to grow, which means that the value added by manufacturing as a percentage of GDP has continued to go down, right? Because the economy is growing and manufacturing is relatively flat. Therefore, manufacturing's share of the economy has gone down, and it's actually dipped below 9.5% in 2025, for the first time ever, and it will probably. It's probably going to stay under that number.
Yeah, we become a services economy. I mean, 70% of GDP roughly is based on services. These are things like software.
And it's interesting. We were talking about this before the show. I wonder if software, a big part of the whole reindustrialization movement and sort of mindset is to kind of focus on atoms rather than bits. Mm-hmm. But it strikes me that software engineering and software production, the way we talk about building products, shipping them, et cetera, reminds me a lot of manufacturing.
Right.
And it's sort of it's similar to a highly automated manufacturing process, more than it is to what we think of as a traditional services sector, because when I think of a service sector, I think of the economic value is directly tied to a human being doing something, right? Either I'm auditing your taxes and billing you by the hour, or I'm bringing a bucket of beers to your table. Right. You're sitting at Buffalo Wild Wings or whatever, or I'm performing I'm mowing your lawn or doing some other kind of service to you. But software manufacturing, software production, one of the things that makes it so economically powerful is that, in theory, you write the code once and sell it multiple times. But so it resembles manufacturing in a way, but we could question whether manufacturing or industrial production should include the software industry, but I think it would muddy the waters too much to include so much non-physical.
I think it
would break all of the data series.
I think too, the question is, do we need to, really it's a matter of perception and how we view manufacturing. What's the purpose of looking at something as in I've manufactured a thing versus I've manufactured a thought or an idea or a concept? These are not necessarily bad, one doesn't replace the other. And just because we're manufacturing something that is not physical doesn't mean we're not productive. Right. And I think that's what we've kind of conflated here in the last couple of years, is we're losing manufacturing, therefore we're not making things anymore.
Right, people are we're a nation of Twitch streamers.
Yeah.
And we don't build things anymore.
Yeah, and we've lost this concept of economic value. A concept is valuable unto itself. It doesn't have to have a physical presence. So, I mean, there's a reason that the American economy is the strongest in the world. And it's not necessarily because we make a bunch of stuff. It's because we're creative, we're innovative, and we have a lot of thought leadership here that allows us that drives a lot of this. And again, the American consumer is pretty strong and wealthy itself.
And one of the things that software does is get productivity in other sectors of the economy unstuck.
Right. Technology is the reason chips are so valuable is because of a lot of the concepts.
Software.
Yeah.
Because software is valuable.
Exactly. AI. It's software right now. And that's what the value is. And if it's helping us progress, increase our quality of life, just general progress for the society that we live in, that's the value that we need to focus on. And it's less about what it is that's producing that value. The question is whether or not it's valuable or not. And the markets largely tell us, are people willing to pay for it?
Right. And then the other big question, to kind of play devil's advocate and argue that there are certain things that we just need to be able to make because of the intrinsic nature of those particular things, whether it's, medical devices, medicine, defense stuff, things that we need to be able to make, like computers and airplanes.
Yeah, national security. That's really what it boils down to is I think, we mentioned it earlier in the show.
And not just national security in the sense of we need to make sure that we have enough bullets to kill everyone we want, but also that we have appropriate control and access to resources that we need to sustain
because
our built environment.
Geopolitical, we have now entered an environment where we have much more geopolitical instability. We're not getting along with each other as well as we used to. And that means that we don't need to necessarily be as reliant on other, countries' supply chains. Whereas it may be more efficient and better if we all got along in an idyllic world where you build things close to where you pull them out of the ground or the raw materials or where the expertise is. That is the best case scenario for a supply chain and how you want to, build your products and have the most efficient businesses. However, we don't live in that world anymore, and now people are less trusting. Trust is expensive. So we need to have something that says that if we need medicines, if we need some of this, the PPI during the pandemic, that we had to rely on other countries who were we need this for our own citizenry. And they're not wrong in that. We need to have the ability to turn that switch on and make some of this stuff that is necessary for us to sustain here in the United States.
Right. And so not all widgets are created equal.
Right.
Some widgets, are, the country can be threatened if we don't, sort of control the production of those widgets. And that's sort of where the concept of industrial policy comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And what makes some, people who are committed to dogmatic free market capitalism uncomfortable, because then it looks like the government's picking winners and losers.
Right.
And being oh no, we, as a government or as a nation, really care about, being able to build nuclear reactors or whatever.
Right.
And so we are just, maybe we're wasting some money and being slightly inefficient, but we just want to make sure we have the ability to build nuclear reactors on the lock.
Right.
And we don't want to ever lose that ability because it's very hard to regain it once you don't have it.
Yeah, and you want to have the infrastructure in place. We talked about it earlier in the show about how long it takes. One of the challenges of the current trade policy is, we're expecting things to just kind of happen, this year. Mm-hmm. When reality is, as you build factories, it takes 3 to 5 years, but there's also a long front end of investment. Budgets, capitalization, things like that go into that decision.
And also the factory is situated in a human community.
Right.
That has to be prepared and developed and brought up to a certain level of quality and standard to be able to build the thing that you're trying to build.
Exactly.
One of the really interesting conversations I had earlier on this show was with Greg Sharrow of Sharrow Marine, who's invented this highly advanced new boat propeller that's being used in like just recreational watercraft, but also in like defense sector applications. And he's really expanding his like it's a high end boat propeller. I think it costs like 5 to 10 times as much as a regular boat propeller. Has very special properties, but he was shipping like 400 of these a month out of a small factory in Detroit. They're currently expanding to be able to ship 2,000 a month. But he told me a story about like why he founded the company in Philly, and why let's say Pennsylvania. And he was telling me about like why he chose to move it to Detroit, and he said it was all because of like human capital. He was part of his manufacturing process involved like really complicated amounts of code to calculate the geometries of these very odd looking propellers that are like these like three-dimensional like metal like loops,
right,
that don't look like blades, right? And he was polling all of these different manufacturing centers around the world, asking them like, okay, like I need to like program this machine to be able to do this and like cut this out of like solid steel, blah, blah, blah. And everyone was giving him quotes of like 4 to 6 weeks to be able to spin up even just like prototypes, right?
right.
And he talked to some fourth generation machinists in Detroit who did it in 30 minutes.
Wow.
And he was like, okay, well, these are my people.
Right.
Clearly, like, I don't know what's going on here, but this is where I need to be.
Right.
And the point is that like deep sort of world-class manufacturing expertise takes like several generations to develop. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen because of a tariff. It doesn't happen because of a corporate manufacturing investment. It's slowly sort of nurtured and grown, like like an ecosystem, like a literal ecosystem.
Yeah, and
with
that's
many interdependent parts that all have
Right.
to thrive together.
And that's why I think this initiative of like saying, hey, we've kind of lost touch with ourselves. Like we need to learn who America is again in terms of manufacturing and our processes, because we've kind of lost our expertise in general in some of these spaces. Not that we can't get it back, but I think we have, I mean, if you let companies and businesses and incentivize them to kind of, get too spread out and too, decentralized, you expose it to a lot of risks. And that's something that we have not kept in check. Like you get this specialization happening in other parts of the globe, like that we've lost an understanding of.
And one of the things I want to talk a little bit about in this episode, Zach, is sort of the disjunction between all of these very large, multi-billion-dollar manufacturing investment announcements, these splashy press releases from the White House and companies like Apple or Micron or Taiwan Semiconductor Company or AstraZeneca.
Right.
The sort of the disjunction between trillions of dollars that are supposedly been pledged to be invested, and the fact that like, well, industrial production in manufacturing is flat. Industrial production total index, which includes the oil and gas industry, it's growing very slowly, but it's sort of near record highs. But manufacturing output hasn't recovered 2018 levels. It's flat. Is it just a matter of timing, or what's going on? Like, how are we supposed to square like St. Louis like Fred data with like what Donald Trump says?
I mean, I don't. I think you never want to get. I never like to get into the politics of the situation, but clearly the White House has a spinning mechanism there that they want to state things, and a lot of these numbers, they already existed in some form or fashion beforehand. We just didn't hear about them. Like Apple investing $800 billion here. Well, that's a $200 billion increase over the next 10 years over what they were already planning to do. And then on top of that, we're getting some of these tax write-off policies that make it a win for them purely.
Right.
And if they're getting 100% write-off on that $200 billion, there's no they've done nothing new. So we're not necessarily seeing anything, it's pulling from one side to the other, but the economic value may be better. You know what I'm saying? Like, because sometimes I don't want to get into the tax write-off situation because, there's the Laffer curve that basically states that too much taxes is counterproductive, too little taxes is counterproductive. Being somewhere in here actually promotes optimal economic value and productivity. So removing taxes, yes, the government may not get, some sort of tax revenue, but that may be more well allocated economically that actually generates more money for the economy and therefore actually shows up in the tax revenue in another way.
Yeah. Right. Like in theory, this will create jobs and
Yeah.
people will be paying income tax, and it'll create like products and people will be paying sales
Yeah,
tax when they buy them.
economies are based on the movement of goods and capital. If you don't have movement, if somebody just holds
If no
on to a
one's
bunch of money,
spending,
this is why autocracies don't work, is because you have money held up in the hands of a
Right.
few and they're not spending it. The most successful economies, why the American economy has done so well, is because you have a lot of participation. You have a lot of jobs, you have a lot of people spending money, you have a lot of people making money. That's what you want in a free market.
people aren't scared of the government.
Right.
Like one of the things that really hampers, the Chinese economy is just like the flight of capital from the country. People like make their first, $2 million in China and immediately buy real estate in California. And which is like horrible for the Chinese economy.
Right.
Right. It's arguably bad for people who live in California, unless you're a real estate agent.
Yeah, if you get
but like to your point, like autocracies and like the need to like hide your money from the government, or like where the political situation is so uncertain or dangerous that like you feel like you have to like hoard your wealth and hide it to just protect yourself, as opposed to investing it. Is very damaging.
Yeah, that's the opposite of what we want in any economy, is for people to hoard their money. This is what caused the Great Depression. People got scared and said, I'm going to pull all my money out of the bank because I don't trust the bank anymore. So what happens almost every kind of financial bubble is somebody gets scared of spending money, and the flow of money is what stops. Like debt collapses because people stop, the transactions stop moving in. The banks don't collect enough money to service the debt that's coming in. So you need monetary flow for an economy to be successful. And once that flow is cut off or it's held in the hands of too few, that's where you see the biggest constrictions on any kind of development or growth.
Right. And to get back to that question, when you sort of put a lot of the manufacturing investment announcements under a microscope and you compare them, say, to like the guidance put out by the same companies on their earnings calls and things like that, you can see like, oh, okay, this seemed like a really giant number, but it only represents like a 15%, increase to their capital spending plan, and it's spaced out over 5 years or whatever. It's not, that interesting. There is, I think, a lot of hope, and I think this will certainly play out. I mean, it's almost a sort of like a law of gravity that bonus depreciation will encourage the construction of manufacturing facilities and production, plants in the U.S.
It just should encourage investment,
just because it's such a powerful incentive, and we've seen it work in other industries. In the past Trump administration, it's something of a cheap accounting trick, but it works for a while, and but yeah,
it's what created the economic boom in 2017-18. Like a lot of that investment, it was a sugar high, is what it was for the economy. We saw this manifest in the freight market. We had a lot of other things going on in the freight market in 2017, 2018, ELDs, Hurricane Harvey, some other stuff that was happening there. We were coming out of kind of a mini freight recession period too, but the economy and investment cycles got a big boost from this bonus depreciation and some of these tax write-offs that a lot of these companies were like, okay, we can just write off all of this for tax purposes this year. And so it kind of like, we're going to invest what we would have done over the next 3 years all in 1 year because we're encouraged to.
Right.
And that's kind of the argument against it a little bit is, are you boosting the economy with kind of the sugar high mentality that's short-lived? But
it's also
as a
just
company,
like
you have to take it almost.
Yeah, you have to take it. It makes too much sense not to, which is
Yeah.
why it works. And will certainly provide like a short-term acceleration in those kinds of investments. But many of them will take years to play out.
Yeah.
You like if you announce that you're going to spend $20 billion in the US somehow on manufacturing, like the the yield on that investment doesn't start accruing until 5 years later, 4
I
years
mean,
later.
a lot of the financial community who I talk to, I myself am a finance person, they thought that a lot of what we saw in 2017 was going to manifest in the second half this year. Now, the financial markets, myself included, sometimes get a little bit ahead of ourselves because we're so used to this fast movement, fast pace. It has not manifested. If you look at GDP, the investment figure is nil. Like,
Right.
we're not seeing any change there. Consumption is actually pretty good and flat-ish if you adjust for inflation. And, the import-export, reconciliation has been throwing it off. But the investment side of things has not happened this year. And that's the thing that the manufacturing, that's what I think a lot of people were expecting this year, was this boost from investment that has not happened yet. So some people have said, well, it's going to happen in 2026. The biggest barrier to this right now is the uncertainty. And that's the overstated cliche of 2025, is uncertainty is king right now, still, in terms of trade policy and growth mechanisms. Because if you think about it this way, we have, of course, a lot of data from import sectors and things like that. And of course, the maritime trade has been hugely impacted by tariffs and things like that. The amount of chaos.
The container rates from China to the west coast of the U.S. Are now like down below $1,500 for a 40-foot container, which is lower than at any other time in 2025 or 2024. We're getting back to like 2023 post-pandemic crash levels.
But think about what was happening in 2021 when everyone was so nervous about having over-reliance on China. Well, a lot of these companies put in a China plus one strategy for sourcing on their supply chain. India was a prime target for that. Guess what just happened to India in August? They got a 50% tariff slapped on them. Now, I'm not here to debate right or wrong because there's war, the Russian war with Ukraine and all that is a part of that. There's politics on top of it too that I don't care to get into. But if you're a company and a business from that aspect, regardless of the reason for what happened there, that tariff now causes you to shut off your import engine and all of your investment into that.
It pins you in place.
And we saw it. Import volumes collapsed almost immediately. That type of uncertainty, because you have now made it too expensive to deal with that country, like you're frozen. Even if you have a bonus depreciation that's saying, hey, build a thing or do something in a place, you're not sure what's going to happen next.
And these sort of like unprecedentedly large manipulations of trade policy have like kind of broken the usefulness of even like the GDP number, unfortunately, which, is GDP in and of itself it's already like a compromise. It's already like a blended aggregate, like if you're really trying to sum up quote unquote economic growth in a single dimension or a single number, you're distorting quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
But the mere fact that a plunge in exports can make what should be like essentially flat economic growth look like it's
growing,
like exploding to like, the fact that what was Q2's like 3.8%,
3.8,
which would be like a massive number that would feel like you're like,
we should be in an economic boom if that in that type of environment. Most economists target a 3% GDP figure for solid, stable growth. Anything above about a 3.5, and certainly once you get closer to 4, that's considered overheated. Yeah. And I don't think any business in Q2 was thinking this was an overheated economy.
And the Fed as well was not,
sure.
Jerome Powell wasn't sitting here thinking like, oh God, we have to slow this thing down.
Well, he just cut interest rates.
Right.
He doesn't cut interest rates in a 4% GDP.
And so it'll be interesting, like in the, long after we're gone in the history books, when people are like looking at the charts of this data, being like, well, in 2025, the US hit 3.8%, everything was great. It's like, no, like,
we also had a negative quarter of growth coming out of the pandemic in 2022 that everybody just kind of washed away as like, no, that wasn't a real recession, when it was really just a quick unhinging of demand on.
We actually had 2 quarters in a row.
Yeah, it was technically, it fit the traditional definition of a recession, but everyone was like, no, and it wasn't. It really wasn't a recession. Yeah. It was just a quick rebalancing.
Right. And so, the theme of this episode is sort of like measuring the manufacturing economy and like all of the ways that sort of like the standard government data series are kind of touching different parts of the elephant, right? And with a blindfold on and trying to guess what it is that we're measuring and characterizing, right? But the manipulation of like the imports and GDP is a huge thing. I didn't ask you to prepare for this question, so I don't expect you to go super deep on it. But I've been thinking a lot about the cases that are coming before the Supreme Court of the United States. Obviously, in our corner of the world, broker liability is a huge one that could have like actual structural impacts on the spot market and the sort of like cleanliness of the spot market, so to speak.
Right.
But the tariff one might even be even bigger, right? So I was curious about this last night, so I went and looked it up, right? So I looked up NAFTA and how it was negotiated and ratified, right? Mm-hmm. So it was negotiated by the obviously by the U.S., Canada, and Mexico, but it was negotiated essentially by the executive branches of those governments. Mm-hmm. Then it was ratified by their Congresses, right? So, I think NAFTA was actually Reagan's idea. It was finally, I think it was signed by George H.W. Bush and then finally implemented under Clinton. Mm-hmm. But like, it had to be sold to the entire American people. It had to get buy-in. We were putting like burdens on the American people in some ways. Like we're agreeing to reciprocal tariffs and agreeing to work together on to build different important commodities. Same thing with the USMCA. The replacement to NAFTA that went live in like 2020.
Right.
Same exact way. Like the Congress, approved all that stuff and they debated and they added different like riders and protections. I think like, for example, Mexico wanted some like protections for like labor, like organized labor and things like that. Now that's very different than the way that the Trump administration has been conducting its its trade policy.
Slightly. Yeah.
It's
very different. This has been a policy of one really that's been implemented in his, base and contingency there that he has himself surrounded by. A lot of it comes from, of course, one of his main economic advisors. And he has been very much kind of protectionist in his traditional policies. And protectionism by itself is fairly counterproductive, but the purpose is to try to create enough balance and equitable positions for these countries. We obviously don't want to lose all of our manufacturing to other places. We don't want to lose the ability, for our
certain types.
Yeah, our domestic manufacturers of not just like things, but also food. The tomatoes, for instance, that had, they just repealed one of the, the things for importing Mexican tomatoes that makes it a little bit more equitable for the, it incentivizes people to grow tomatoes in America a little bit more because you have something that comes in that's cheaper that kind of undermines your ability. Now if we lose that relationship with Mexico, we don't have tomatoes. So we want to make sure that we have some of that here. That happens across agriculture in general. this upcoming Supreme Court case is really addressing how much authority does the president have over implementing policy alone. And traditionally, it's supposed to be Congress. And if this...
Because it's like, and when you think about it, it's like, okay, like, I get the fact that Trump considers himself to be a very good negotiator. I get the fact that he loves working on like sort of one-on-one like deals, right?
Well, it's faster. I think he views, and largely, again, his contingency is that government is fat and bloated and they're too slow and they've gotten too, external influence from other places. And he thinks he knows best. And that's the big debate is his speed and efficiency of execution worth and necessary in this period of time? Because that's really the debate. Is this necessary? Is he executing his authority under legal authority? Because here in America, we don't like one person having too much authority.
Right. And right now we have a situation where one guy is basically making the GDP number do whatever he wants.
And it's not just one guy. He has several advisors there.
But you know what I'm saying? Like I mean, it whether you agree with his trade policies or not, we've seen the economic damage that can result from one person unpredictably introducing tariffs on a whole bunch of things, and no one really knows why.
Well, it's why we have,
or whether they're not.
It's why we have councils. Like bureaucracy, most of the time, like we kind of view bureaucracy as kind of a negative because it's slow. We've all dealt with it in our own local governances. Not a lot of, you get, what is it when the old saying about you built a camel as a horse drawn by a committee? When you get too much groupthink going on, it's really inefficient and you don't get the best possible outcome. However, it also makes sure that you are not getting too buried into one person's
you're not getting tunnel vision. And hopefully you're getting something that's like a product of consensus. Right? And something that's like a lasting framework. Like when NAFTA was passed, that gave a lot of companies like certainty about like what the sort of North American trade landscape is going to be. Same thing with the USMCA. These trade policies are not doing that, and you wonder like what happens to the economy if John Roberts decides just to pull the plug on this like experiment with like unilateral tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing you're trying to guard against. You don't really, once you get to a certain size and scale, you lose your ability to be fast in general. There's not a lot you can do there unless you put the power all in.
Re-centralize authority.
Yeah, and that's kind of the debate here. And of course, in America, we do not like too much centralized power. Right. We were built off of a decentralization of power on purpose.
Right. Arguably, the reason why like our business community is so dynamic and powerful is because like our government sucks at regulating it.
Yeah. You don't want the Republican Party, the conservatives on historically do not like government involvement. This is the opposite of that in a lot of ways.
Right. And the free trade, I think the free trade dogma, especially with regard to China, was, I think, first broken during Trump's like election campaign, really in 2015 and 2016, and eventually through the course of his first term was adopted by both parties, where both parties are kind of realizing that our relationship with China has to change. But that still doesn't mean that like he's just like sort of unhinged, like shotgun blast in every direction. Like the Day of Liberation was like, it doesn't make the Day of Liberation like constitutional or legal or a good idea.
Yeah, and that's we're starting to delve into the politics of a situation a little bit more, and we probably shouldn't go that far.
That's true, but I mean, my main point here is that like the fallout from Liberation Day like messed with like economic data, and now it's up for review under the Supreme Court. No one really knows what John Roberts is going to do, and the other members of the Supreme Court. They've they've given Trump some wins.
Yeah.
They've reined him in on other things. Who knows? But if they were to just get rid of all the unilateral tariffs, what then would happen?
Well, I think the reality is that not a lot would happen immediately. We would probably see this administration try another avenue, because now you have billions of dollars in these tariff revenues sitting there. They would have to go through the process of figuring out how to redistribute that money, and then you have this
True.
this implementation cycle kind of being undone overnight that would cause pretty significant shockwaves, but it's not going to happen overnight. And I think you're going to see continued efforts to kind of hold on to these tariffs that we just don't like. Trump, if anything, has been somebody who has just kept chipping away and throwing something out there and seeing if it'll land.
Yeah.
And I think you're going to see an ongoing portion of that. And you're still not going to have the certainty. And that's the thing we need to eliminate, is the uncertainty.
Right. And, it's one thing to say that the president shouldn't sort of unilaterally impose trade policy, but I don't necessarily think that Supreme Court justices should be the ones to do that either.
No, but that's not the point. That power is supposed to.
But what I'm saying is that they might come with some sort of narrow ruling that applies to certain pieces of what he did, but
from their
in
position, they need to rule on the execution of that emergency power that he is levying here.
Right.
Does it? And I think anybody with you don't have to be a lawyer to know that the intent of the rule that he is executing upon is not applicable here in most people's minds. This is not an emergency situation, and it certainly wasn't the intent of the rule that he is executing upon. It's become a partisan situation.
This is almost becomes like a meta-political question. There's this old idea of the state of exception, right? Which is ultimate power in any kind of political system resides with the person who has the ability to say when the rules do and do not apply.
Yeah.
Right.
And honestly, from that perspective, this is a different discussion than just reshoring and manufacturing and all that kind of stuff. And that's for a bunch of lawyers to kind of sit there and philosophically debate. But Trump has made himself very adept at finding technicalities and exploiting them and using them to his advantage and making sure that whatever he thinks is right gets executed on. Now, you can agree with that if you want to. That's fine. But economically speaking, right now, there's a lot of reasons to think that is not going as planned.
Yeah, it's not going as planned so far. It's definitely choking off imports, and freight volumes for sure have been not anemic, but actually severely underperforming. What's interesting about this story is that all of these really aggressive policy measures have taken place so early in his term that we're going to see it play out for the next 3.5 years.
Until the midterms potentially. That's the thing. I think that's one of the reasons. And again, this is more of a political discussion, and I don't like the politics of anything. But I think the reason we see the speed of execution is to make sure that he has Congress, he has some of these partisan, this partisan power while they have it, to make sure he doesn't have as much resistance.
Interesting. Well, with that, I guess we'll have to come back here in a few years after the midterms and see if the American electorate was, if manufacturing economic data became a wedge issue in the 2026 midterm elections.
Yeah. And, things change quickly.
Yeah, things change quickly. Zach, thank you so much for coming on. Stay tuned on this channel, Bring It Home. We're on YouTube. You can find us, of course, on streaming on freightwaves.com. The website, bringithome.us, has all of our past episodes. Subscribe to the newsletter, and we will see you next time.